Hello, and welcome to the first ever pop-up forum hosted by the Massachusetts Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, or EEA. My name is Jason Marshall, and I'm the Deputy Secretary for Federal and Regional Energy Affairs at EEA. First, you might be wondering why we're calling this a pop-up forum. Well, you might have encountered a pop-up forum at a store or an event at some point in your travels. And like those pop-ups, we see these forums as unanticipated, one-time events. They're really a vehicle for providing information about an emerging or timely New England energy issue. And in this way, they're more spontaneous than a regular conference or event, and they're closer in time from announcement to the day of the event. For this forum, our first one, we're focusing on grid enhancing technologies, or GETs as they're commonly called. GETs are a prime example of the promise of innovation in moving us to a modern, clean energy grid. They're tools to get more out of the transmission system, both our current infrastructure and when new construction is needed. Be warned, like much in the energy space, this is a highly technical area, but we're very fortunate to have with us experts on our panel who are going to help us sort through it. And if GETs are new to you, hopefully this session provides a starting point to build on. So we're going to begin today with a technical background on grid enhancing technologies, or again, GETs, as I said, and then we'll move to our panel on the regulatory landscape for GETs. We'll then shift to strategies and approaches for integrating GETs in New England, and we'll finish up with some questions and answers. So hopefully some of you have some questions out there, and we'll be enabling the Q&A feature when we get to that point in our program. But first, I'm pleased to welcome our Secretary of Energy and Environmental Affairs, Rebecca Tepper, to join us for a few minutes. And Secretary Tepper, thanks for being here today.
Thanks for having me. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for this pop-up forum. I'm excited to launch this with Wheezy and Jason, and they've done a great job coming up with a first topic today of grid enhancing technologies. You know, as you all know, we in Massachusetts, like so many other states, are trying to electrify and decarbonize. And as we do that, we want to make sure that building isn't our first choice, building new. We hope that our first choice is using what we already have efficiently. And I know that that's what you're going to talk about today. And they're a prime example of how innovation is going to allow us to save money while we're also providing more reliability and hopefully at a less costly. So as we all know, it looks like FERC's about ready to issue an order on interconnection, and hoping that we'll see this as part of it. I think we will, and we're hoping that we'll be able to get this used more in ISO New England and throughout the country, because we really want to make sure that when we are thinking about how we move forward, we're thinking about environmental justice communities and how we can make sure that they are not paying more than they should for this transition. So really looking forward to hearing from the panelists, and I will turn it back.
Thank you, Secretary. Thanks for being here. I'm going to kick it over to my colleague, Assistant Secretary Nuara, to introduce herself, the panel, and start with panel one.
Great. Thank you, Jason. Much appreciated. And thank you, Secretary Tepper, for those welcoming remarks as well. My name is Wheezy Nuara. I am the Assistant Secretary for Federal and Regional Energy Affairs at the Massachusetts Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. And I am thrilled to be here this afternoon. Thank you all for joining us. I would like to introduce our panel, all of our panelists, before we jump into panel one, the technical background on GETs. So if all of our panelists could come online very briefly, I will have each of them introduce herself or himself quickly, and then we will move right into panel one. So David, how about you kick it off?
Sure. Hi, my name is Dave Quire. I work for PPL. I'm responsible for the transmission systems in Rhode Island as well as Pennsylvania. It's nice to be here.
Thanks, David. Brent, how about you?
Hi, I'm Brent Oberlin, Director of Transmission Planning, generally responsible for long-term reliability assessments of the New England system.
Great. Thank you, Brent. And Julia?
Hi, everyone. I'm Julia Selker. I'm the Executive Director of the WATT Coalition, and we're the trade association representing grid enhancing technologies and other companies who are interested in seeing GETs deployed widely across the United States. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. Bruce?
Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Bruce Tsuchida. I work at the Bretto Group. It's a consultancy, and I've done a lot of grid enhancing technology related studies and presentations in the past. I thank you for inviting me to this panel.
Thank you, Bruce. Katie?
Hello, I'm Katie Signer. I'm a manager on the Clean Competitive Grids team within our carbon-free electricity practice at RMI, and have been working on market reforms and RTO processes that might need to evolve to accommodate the changing resource mix we're seeing for the past few years now.
Thank you, Katie. And Tehran.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. Pleasure to be here. My name is Tehran Hill. I'm Director of Clean Energy Development here at National Grid, really helping to push forward a clean energy future for all of us. Thank you.
Great. Thank you all so much. We really appreciate you all being here today as experts in the field. And I will ask that Bruce, David, and Brent stay on camera. So they will be our panelists for panel number 1, a technical background on grid enhancing technologies. And we'll go ahead and get started. So I'll turn it over to Bruce to provide a high-level overview of technologies with a focus on dynamic line ratings, advanced power flow control, and topology optimization. Take it away, Bruce. And Bruce, quick reminder that you are on mute still.
There you go. Is the screen looking fine for everybody?
It is, Bruce. Looks
Thank
great.
you. So what I will do here is discuss what, at a general high-level overview, what grid enhancing technologies are, and that's only to set the tone of the discussion for today. Let me start with what grid enhancing technologies are. It's a definition that's not well defined. And in this session today, we're gonna assume it's topology optimization, which is opening and closing circuits to reroute flows to avoid congestion or overloaded facilities. Dynamic line rating, which everyone probably knows about. It improves the thermal ratings used on the actual weather conditions. So it allows more power to flow when it's colder or windier, and there's more of a cooling effect. And there's an advanced power flow control, which is fax devices or small electronics devices that are used to flow or direct the flow of power flow into one direction or another. There are other technologies that potentially qualify as GETs or gets bucketed into the GETs. Batteries may be one of them. Advanced conductors may be another one of them. There's the possibilities are endless, but in order to get some discussion, or at least not to deviate too much into the different technologies, for today's discussion, we're going to assume that these 3 technologies are the grid enhancing technologies that the discussion will be focused on. These technologies can be installed quickly and cost effectively. It actually helps maximize the capability of the existing transmission system. They can provide temporary or permanent solutions depending on how you utilize them. Furthermore, as they can be added quickly, they can also be removed quickly, and they don't necessarily jeopardize the existing system. So for example, you can install grid enhancing technologies to understand the conditions of the grid and leave it up to the operators whether you want to use that feature or not. In a certain way, it's like the GPS in your automobile. You can use the GPS as a way to guide your driving. You don't necessarily have to listen to the GPS. All the GPS is telling you is making suggestions saying that if you go to make a right at the next signal, you can avoid transmission congestion or road congestion. So it's one of those technologies. The GPS, when it's obsolete, you can throw it out. If it breaks, you can throw it out. That's not going to help. That's not going to do anything to your car. If you need another one for your second car, you can go to the market and buy it for $100 or $200, and it will significantly improve the way that you drive your car. But it is not replacing the car. It does not replace the roads. And it's just making the operational a lot easier. So it can help in both the long term and the short term. These technologies are actually complementary to building new transmission. So how do they complement new transmission? First off, it can provide a bridge between today and when the new permanent solution is available. Transmission planning typically takes 3 to 5 to 10 years for planning. In the meantime, the grid is congested. So if you can utilize these technologies in the interim term to avoid some of that congestion, that's one way of using it. And once the permanent solution is in place, because these are portable technologies, you can move them away, or you can keep them in place just for other purposes. It will reduce the impact of transmission outages as well. So the outages can happen in 2 ways. One is the planned outages. I understand that New England is utilizing some of the topology optimization or running tests with the topology optimization, trying to figure out how to reduce the congestion during outages. That is sponsored by the Mass CEC. But it can also be when you're interconnecting the new line that you're building to the existing grid. So how do you avoid congestion caused by that outage, which can take several weeks when you're trying to interconnect new lines? It can also smooth out the lumpiness of transmission investments. Just like generation, transmission is also a lumpy investment. The next upgrade for the transmission may actually provide you with too much of a capacity, much more than you need. So you can use grid enhancing technologies until the need actually justifies the transmission. It also helps increase the benefit to cost ratio of new projects to transmission lines. Because what happens occasionally is that when you add new transmission and all of a sudden you realize that, hey, there's this new congestion on the underlying system that I didn't know. It's like when you connect a new highway to a local road, the local road may all of a sudden see new congestion patterns. You can use grid enhancing technologies to resolve those local congestions, again, until the next opportunity arises, until you can replace that congestion with a permanent solution. Now, all this sounds very nice. It also has financial implications too. One is because these costs are low and you can add them incrementally compared to transmission, the impact on rate is significantly smaller than building new transmission. And it also hedges against the load projection. In many cases, more transmission is needed because you're looking at load growth or increase in load or different generation. But there's always uncertainty associated with that. So it's very hard for the utility to convince the regulator saying, hey, I need to invest another $10 million in this line. Alternatively, you can add these grid enhancing technologies for a much lower cost. And so there's the potential avoidance of risk of financial risks and also the system and equipment risk going forward that these technologies can help. Now, the benefits that we observed for grid enhancing technologies through the multiple tests or pilot projects are in the range of $100 million or more, depending on how widespread they're distributed. So I show that here a few examples. In a study for PJM, production cost savings for a year and only in the real-time market went over $100 million. Pacific Gas and Electric Company's review of their system showed that 2,000 DSRs are flow control devices, helped mitigate thermal overloading of 230 kV line, and that led to roughly a 75% cost savings compared to reconductoring. I think there's going to be other discussion about PPL, how the dynamic line rating option by PPL has helped reduce a lot of cost. But there's also other benefits. Many of the European studies indicate that DLR's contribution will enhance wind integration. They tend to reduce wind curtailment by 15 to 20%, depending on where it is, and they can be installed pretty much quickly. Belgium is a prime example of those. And it furthermore enables more generation to interconnect as well, because you're seeing less congestion on the transmission line. In a study that we did, and it's part of further readings that I'll discuss later, we found that using the 3 types of grid enhancing technologies that I mentioned, topology optimization, dynamic line rating, and advanced power flow control, using the Southwest Power Pool as a test bed, can allow double the amount of renewables to be integrated. And the payback period of these grid enhancing technologies were about half a year. So you can see that benefit. And it also helps increase the operational awareness, because without dynamic line rating, you actually don't know how much your line is sagging or how much it's annealing, but you get that information along. And again, it's very low cost, so it will very, very much help cash stranded utilities. Before we go into that, one thing to remember about these technologies, that they're actually utilizing the existing grid. They're trying to enhance the way that you use the existing grid. Again, similar to the GPS in your car, the GPS will help you to utilize the existing roads. It's not necessarily making you build new roads, but it saves you a lot of driving time. And so that is what's going on with the grid enhancing technologies as well. And with that, I am going to introduce you a few more reports that we've done, and then hand it over to David, who will talk about dynamic line ratings on the PPO system. Now,
All right. Sorry about that. We had some technical difficulties in the background there. But Bruce, if that's where you are going to hold, I'll pass it over to David to give us a deeper dive on dynamic line ratings and provide his perspective given his experience as a utility. So David, if you're ready, I will hand it over to you.
Sounds good. Thanks, Weezy. I appreciate that intro, Bruce. Essentially, Secretary Tepper actually teed it up in the beginning, in that the power grid has historically had the tug of war between reliability and cost, where we invest more in the system to improve reliability, get those gains, but then increase customer costs, and vice versa. We don't invest in the system, well, then we end up hurting reliability, put in hurdles in front of interconnections and roads trying to connect. But there are new technologies and innovation and initiatives that do achieve both, that both improve the reliability in the system and give us better asset health data, enable us to make better maintenance and investment decisions, and still reduce costs for customers. And to us at PPL, one of those foremost technologies in order to do that is dynamic line ratings. This is a picture of a sensor that's open. They're actually relatively simple devices. They essentially measure the temperature of the air, the temperature of the transmission line itself, wind speed, and vibration. And what it enables us to do is, when a transmission line is built, whether it's an old line or a new line, it's assigned a rating. And that rating is assigned by engineers that have to be conservative, because if they're not conservative, then at the worst time of the year, there could be a line failure. So they assume things like the worst case temperature, say the middle of summer, that they may assume that there's no wind blowing, because wind is one of the foremost factors that increases a line's rating. So they layer on and stack conservative assumptions, and that becomes what's called the static rating of that transmission line. What dynamic line ratings enables us to do is basically peel back all those assumptions, because we don't need to anymore, because we're actually getting the real data. We know what the wind speed is. We know what the conductor temperature is. We know what the temperature is outside at that point. And it enables us to maximize the use of the equipment that's already been built. And when we look to quantify those benefits, the first line that we put this on was in Pennsylvania. It was called the Harwood-Susquehanna line. It's from the Susquehanna area of Pennsylvania. And it ended up saving an annual congestion cost to customers $23 million a year. And the project that would have also relieved that congestion was a rebuild project that we estimated would be about $50 million. We end up spending about $250,000 for the dynamic line rating installation of that specific line that generated these savings. And I think our learnings from it too was that even if a rebuild is a long-term solution, say a decade-long solution, from the time that we decided to put dynamic line ratings on our first line till the time the sensors were in the air sending back data was only 6 months. So customers were able to realize those savings much faster than, say, a traditional solution, even if the traditional solution was going to end up being needed in the future. And the other key to it for us was that when it comes to the major pieces of equipment that make up the transmission system, like transformers, circuit breakers, conductors, most of the existing components already have monitor and sensor packages that we outfit on. So take a transformer. We already have a transformer monitor that sends back data so that we know we can optimize maintenance and reduce maintenance costs, and so that we know when it should be replaced and we don't replace it too soon or too far off. We never had a good stream of data coming back from our conductors. And so somewhat of a side benefit to dynamic line ratings also is it gives us more data so that we're not replacing lines earlier than they need to be replaced, or that we're not waiting too long either. This is an overview of the structure of what it looks like, because there's a lot. Really, the sensor is I'll say the easy part. Actually, if I go back, this picture here of the gentleman hanging off the helicopter, that was a picture of our first installation. It literally takes about 15 minutes to hang the sensor, and they can be installed live. And so the sensor really is somewhat of the more simple part of the equation. It's the IT network and the algorithms that are downstream of it that really are what make it work. And so if we started from the left, each line has multiple sensors depending on where it runs through a certain geography. And this is some of the data that is heading back. And then it runs into a cloud server that basically runs algorithms on it, which is it has formulas that will calculate a rating based off of the data set that's coming in. And Passamon is our vendor, but there's numerous vendors that are available. And if I just stay at the top, essentially, then once that rating is calculated, it comes into our transmission control system. And on our screens that are visible to operators and et cetera, we can see the ratings change. We essentially get a new rating every 5 minutes. And so it builds the path from sensor all the way through to the control center where it can be seen by operations. And then separately, as I mentioned about the asset health data, engineers are also able to take the health data and make smarter decisions on for maintenance and replacement. I call this top path kind of like the easy path of getting it within our control center, starting to look and digest the data and go from there. But where it really hasn't, dynamic line ratings really has an impact to customers is when it starts to plug into real-time market operations, and when we start to make decisions on it based off of that really help the grid holistically. And so the separate path is that it goes through and plugs into the local RTO, which in New England is ISO New England, and our footprint in Pennsylvania, it's PJM, and they really have the minds that focus on market operations and have that great holistic view of the grid. And when they're able to access the data, they're able to connect dots that piece things together. That also helps customers too. And so this just kind of shows a block diagram topology of how it works. I'm at PPL, but it's really about the sensors, the formulas and the algorithms that we work with the vendors on, and then really tying that out all the way through and working with the ISO New Englands and the PJMs to make it happen for customers. Just to be transparent with some of the challenges that we saw are listed here, maybe just to highlight an example of one of them, the second bullet here says ratings management. So for instance, we saw a 30% increase in our line ratings went from the static rating to the same line with dynamic line ratings installed. And 30%, obviously is a tremendous difference. But one of the things that we run into is typically on a transmission line, the most limiting component is the line itself. So now when you increase the value of that line, you have to look to see if maybe there's another limiting component that is different than the conductor. So what we found was once we would put dynamic line ratings on a line, it would increase the rating so much that now maybe the limiting component is a piece of equipment in a substation that we necessarily didn't have to worry about before. So it also kind of changes our paradigm on how we look at how the grid is built and where we invest. That, the good news is typically when you're investing on say substation equipment, it tends to be lower cost than when you're looking at rebuilding lines. And so those are just kind of new ways that our planning engineers and our standards engineers had to look at this subject in order to make sure that we're maximizing the use of the technology. But I really have to, call out just the different regional transmission organizations like New England and PJM, being a pleasure to work with, as well as NERC and NPCC and Reliability First. They really have a way of looking pragmatically at these technologies and working to figure out how we can get over these challenges. I welcome any questions and thank you again.
Thanks so much, David. Appreciate that. A deeper dive into DLR is extremely helpful and a great segue into Brent Oberlin's presentation. He will provide his perspective on the promise of grid enhancing technologies and touch on some of the current deployment challenges as the grid operator. So I will turn it over to you, Brent.
Wheezy, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can, Brent.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. So to go over a few things about grid enhancing technologies, we'll jump right into it. So as has been described so far, the grid enhancing technologies that we're focused on today are those that are really looking at adjusting the topology of the system. Dynamic line ratings, power flow controllers, and topology adjustment itself. These are really things that allow us to maximize the use of a system which is potentially thermally limited. And what I mean by that is those parts of the power system that are constrained by their ability to move power through a line or a certain set of lines just based on the temperature limitations of that line. So the grid enhancing technologies allow us to move more power through the transmission facilities before they become overloaded. And this is where you can have a fair amount of system benefit, where you have thermal limitations kind of in your way. However, New England itself is not thermally limited for the most part. Most of our interfaces are to the point now where they're either stability or voltage based. And what that means is we have to make sure that all the machines on the system remain in synchronism with each other. They're all turning at the same speed and continue to do so. And for some of the newer technologies like batteries and wind farms and things like that, we need to make sure that they stay online. And the reason that we have gotten ourselves to the point of being voltage or stability limit across most of the system is that we have made an extensive build out over the past 20 years. And you can see report after report saying that there's very little congestion in the New England system. So there may be a use case for grid enhancing technologies, but we really need to step back and make sure that we think about what their expense means and what complexity they bring to the system versus the benefit on a system that we have low congestion and is voltage or stability limited. With that said, there's already avenues for consideration of these technologies under the current tariff. It's interesting to see how the technology is growing over time. It was probably 10 years or so ago, I had proposed installing power flow controllers on one of our lines. And at that time, there was this general outcry from numerous parties that cybersecurity was a big boogeyman that couldn't be overcome. And we're seeing people make their way past that now, which is fantastic. So going into the first technology, DLRs, their primary benefit is providing up-to-date ratings in real-time and near real-time operation of the system. As David talked about, there are getting better and better methods of forecasting in the 24 to 48 hour range. They can be considered in planning, but there has to be certain considerations taken into account. So, and most of these bullets were written with a load serving thought in mind, but there are other opportunities where grid enhancing technologies like DLRs may actually be appropriate. So when we're doing planning studies, this is going to sound silly, but you still have to assume it's hot out during a summer peak load condition. And I'm actually going to skip down one. If we've done our rating methodologies correctly and the DLRs are working correctly under that super, super hot day in the middle of the summer where the wind has just kind of died, the ratings the DLRs should be transmitting back to the control center should be those that are the same that are in this in the studies. So when we're looking at load serving, you're not going to gain a lot from that perspective moving to DLRs. Flipping the equation a little bit, New England over probably the next 8-10 years looks like it has the potential to go from a summer peaking system to a winter peaking system where the highest customer demand would be in the winter. We're moving toward ambient adjusted ratings, which are ratings that are vary with ambient temperature. They're not DLRs. They don't account for the impact of wind speed. But these ambient adjusted ratings will actually allow us to use generally higher equipment ratings as it gets colder out. And this has an interesting knock-on effect that when we're doing winter peak load and planning studies, we will be able to assume a colder ambient temperature than we have been able to in the past. So that's something that ambient adjusted ratings are bringing to the table. Like most areas of the country, New England must implement ambient adjusted ratings by July of 2025 as a result of FERC Order 81. And one of the things that implementation of ambient adjusted ratings is bringing to the forefront is that when we move forward with all the upgrades to our software and processes, et cetera, that are necessary for AARs, it's actually going to lay most of the groundwork we need for incorporating DLRs into real-time operations. That was actually a big hurdle for a very long time. I should note, though, that New England has been using manual ambient adjusted ratings for quite some time. There's actually an area on the system where the ratings are changed quite frequently, so we can maximize the ability to export generation out of certain constrained pockets. So the real question that we need to answer, much like my last slide, is whether or not you go from the next step of moving from ambient adjusted ratings to dynamic line ratings, because what you're picking up is the impact of wind and whether or not that cost is worth it. The other pieces of technology we're focused on today are power flow controllers and topology controllers. And again, the first bullet hopefully states the obvious, that in order to create a meaningful change on the performance of the system, these devices need to create a worthwhile change in impedance or topology. If you just kind of nudge the system on the side, you haven't accomplished anything and you might as well not have wasted your time. Since we're talking about changes that are notable enough to be able to move power to areas on different facilities than what they naturally would want to, you need to be able to model and understand that. And this is where the challenge comes in, is we are currently facing a pretty growing issue where the devices that are being developed and manufactured, it's fantastic technology, but it's actually moving ahead faster than the capabilities of the modeling software to to capture these devices, understand what they're going to do, and make sure they're right for the application. We're already hitting this today. It's really fascinating when we are able to, again, implement controls and things like that on devices which have been around for 20 years, but the control methodologies are getting more and more complicated, and we can't really capture the benefit in these tools. The typical tool that we use for longer term planning is called PSSE, but the more important and more concerning thing is what goes on in the energy management system. This is a piece of software that is watching what the power system is doing 24/7 and making sure that it is ready for certain categories of events any second of the day. And if that isn't working right, the operators don't know where they are, and they're not sure that they're providing a secure system to customers. So this is something that really needs to be overcome. This is something we've been bringing up at various user group meetings, begging these vendors to come forward with updates to the software so we can more easily incorporate these devices. We're also running into computing power issues. Right now, stability simulations are performed in offline studies rather than real time. And that's okay when you have a fixed system that's well understood, but as you begin adding more and more devices that increase the variability in what that system can look like, then the difficulty in evaluating the necessary system states increases. And so what happens is those that are doing the studies are going to need to make simplifications, which may actually reduce some of the potential benefit of these devices. For all these reasons, we need to make sure that any automatic controls are simple and predictable so that operators can anticipate their actions so that we don't have anything unusual happen when system events are occurring. What most folks don't understand is that as a storm is rolling through an area, it's not uncommon to lose 8 to 10 transmission lines, if at least momentarily. And the operators need to be able to make sure that they are understanding what the next steps are to take. And if they have some incredibly complicated control scheme out there, they're not actually going to know where the system's headed. So similar to AIRs, the ISO has been manually implementing topology changes to improve system performance for quite a long time now. But we're actually looking for ways to improve that. We are working with a software vendor that their package will automatically identify topology control solutions for thermal constraints. Now, this is being done with an eye toward minimizing congestion, and I would say it's still pretty early in the vendor's development stage. The ISO is providing a significant amount of feedback, but this is something that we are trying out, trying to see if we can squeeze more out of the system and get benefit for customers for. So with that, Wheezy, I'll turn it back to you.
Great. Thank you, Brent. Very helpful. Always great to hear from the grid operator and some of the unique challenges that you're seeing. We are running just a couple minutes past, so I will turn it over to Jason to get started on panel 2. And thank you all again, David, Bruce, and Brent, for setting the table so nicely for the discussion. Take it away, Jason.
Yeah, that was a great way to kick us off, and I'll echo the big thanks to our first 3 panelists for providing a really helpful grounding on these technologies. You know, in the first instance, these tools need to work from a technology perspective, but that's not the end of the story. The regulatory structure matters here. Brent noted that in terms of modeling the system, that the capabilities of the model are being outpaced by the technology. And the same case may be applying with respect to the regulatory structure, and there may be some catching up from a regulatory standpoint. And we have a great panel here to help us sort through that. I'm going to invite Julia to come off and to begin the discussion by providing a high-level overview.
Great, thank you so much. Glad to be here. I'm going to foolishly invite everyone to multitask while I speak very quickly, but I've just dropped a link in the chat that gives you some basic graphics on what these 3 technologies that you've heard mentioned are, how they work. So hopefully that's a useful reference in case in case anyone is lost. And for those who are watching the recording, you'll have to just find the WAC Coalition website. But anyways, I'm here to give you an overview of the regulatory landscape, the first steps that are being taken today, and then the wish list that we think will really bring grid enhancing technologies into common practice, tool in the toolbox, use on a daily basis. So this is the WAC Coalition that I mentioned in my introduction. You can see renewable energy developers, a transmission owner, clean energy finance, and then lots of vendors who've had grid enhancing technologies commercialized for 10 plus years and deployed around the world. So we're here to make sure that the US customers start seeing some of the benefits that we're seeing globally, and that David Quire already mentioned Pennsylvania is seeing. So the question I put to you all is, where does traditional cost of service regulation get us? And that's most transmission owners see a rate of return on their investments in transmission assets. So those are multi-$100 million transmission lines, and we're talking about grid enhancing technologies, which in David's example, you can see cost only $250,000 in that deployment that was saving $23 million a year. So what we're seeing is many pilots, few operational projects. I've shared a screenshot of a map that the WAC Coalition has of deployments in the United States, and my dream is that you'll have to zoom in a lot further to see dots resolve in the next few years. And the key obstacles we're seeing are inertia and lack of experience in the United States. And as Brent discussed, there's a lot of integration into utility and system operator processes and planning and standards that needs to happen. So we're working on getting that moving. But there also is an incentive issue. There's no reward or requirement for anyone on the system to increase efficiency, save money, reduce congestion when it comes to the transmission system. So it's nobody's job and nobody's incentivized to do it. So this is a key issue. We think if that incentive problem is solved, we would be looking at a different landscape in the United States. We are seeing some motion, obviously. This is a map of the different line rating methodologies that are used in the different RTOs. As you can see, several are capable of accepting dynamic line ratings, and all of them are required to accept dynamic line ratings by 2025, based on FERC Order 881, which was mentioned earlier as well. We also see ERCOT evaluating dynamic line ratings in their economic transmission planning. So that's a key thing, that transmission planning has been done for decades, maybe centuries, based on reliability as the key goal, and that should always be the key goal. But there's also economics at play, and transmission planners have the opportunity to reduce congestion and deliver cheaper power reliably through grid enhancing technologies. Another RTO action that we're really excited about is a brand new process launched in the Mid-Continent ISO using congestion costs, inviting grid users to resolve congestion with topology optimization solutions. So essentially a generator, for instance, would say, wow, we're seeing a lot of curtailment. We can be delivering cheaper power to customers if we open this circuit breaker or close this circuit breaker. They evaluate that solution on their own and then propose it to MISO and the transmission owner, and MISO and the transmission owner evaluate the reliability impacts, and they have to see, wide system benefit out of the solution. They're not just trying to solve a problem for the grid user. They're trying to look at the full scope. And then if the solution passes muster, then it's implemented. And they're looking to do this whole process within 15 days. So that's enough time to start saving money if there's an outage, either planned or unplanned. And we're really excited about this model as a first step in implementing topology optimization in near real time. Let's see, similar processes proposed at SPP. ERCOT's independent market monitor also recommended a similar process. So there's a lot of momentum behind this, and we really appreciate MISO's leadership in putting this together. The organization of MISO states was very engaged. The market monitor in MISO was very engaged. So it takes a whole spectrum of of folks to get these changes done, but exciting momentum here. And speaking of momentum, Secretary Tepper mentioned that we're expecting to see an interconnection rule out of FERC as soon as this week. And the notice of proposed rulemaking that FERC put forward included a requirement to consider GETS in interconnection studies. And that would be a huge deal for grid enhancing technologies. It would mean that the ISOs would have to figure out how to model GETS effectively. And yeah, that would just be a big deal. It won't be easy. It will take some work, but we think that this is worthy of being a top priority. The planning NOPR, or notice of proposed rulemaking at FERC, also includes a requirement to consider GETS. And then there are a few open inquiries that haven't reached the NOPR stage, but they've taken stakeholder comments on. So one of those is a requirement for utilities to evaluate GETS based on a congestion threshold. So if you have a line that's offering, well, maybe not $23 million a year in congestion, but it's creating, for instance, $2 million a year. That was the threshold proposed by PJM. Then you should consider grid enhancing technologies to resolve that congestion and save money and deploy them if it's cost effective. Another model that the Watt Coalition put forward with Advanced Energy United is a shared savings incentive, which is a version of performance-based regulation where utilities would share in the congestion mitigation value of GETS. So that's not the reliability benefits or visibility or the $50 million line that was avoided. It's just the congestion value. The utilities would save, say, 25% of the mitigated congestion would go to them. 75 is still going to the customer, 75%. And that would be a way to create that incentive and get over that the obstacle that I mentioned earlier. And then finally, independent transmission monitoring is an idea that came out of the joint task force on electric transmission's work on transmission cost containment. And we think that having an independent monitor looking at transmission operations and with full information that would otherwise be, sensitive, that would help identify opportunities for GETS, give us more transparency, because when we're talking about this potential requirement threshold and PJM puts forward $2 million as a limit, it's hard. Vendors certainly, and also other industry folks who work with the Watt Coalition don't know how many lines that applies to, whether they're voltage or stability or thermally limited. So this transparency problem is a big issue, and that came up a lot at 2 Sundays ago. The Joint Task Force took up grid enhancing technologies as their topic. That's the FERC commissioners and then 10 state utility commissioners, and transparency came up many times in terms of understanding what's going on. Try and motor through here. There are also DOE programs to support GETS deployments. We count $13 billion that came out of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, where GETS are eligible technologies. So that should also hopefully help see more deployment. I want to just drill down on interconnection, since we're looking at a notice of proposed rulemaking, or sorry, a rule out of the NOPR. A story that really drove the point home for me was when a Watt member talked about these 1% to 3% line overloads that came up in system impact studies for their projects. And they were quoted 50 to 400 million, not a typo, in terms of rebuilding those lines to make their projects viable. And these 1% to 3% line overloads are firmly in the realm of what DLR, for instance, could solve. But the transmission owners in these cases weren't comfortable with those as solutions. So we really think that a requirement to consider GETS and interconnection, we could start to see GETS deployed in situations like this. And as David mentioned, GETS deployments are completed in months, while big line rebuilds are completed in years, if you can even get your outage scheduled. So we're looking to reduce interconnection costs, shorten study and construction timelines, serve as bridge projects to get some of the capacity needed as bigger upgrades are underway. I think Bruce mentioned that value of GETS, and then hopefully see fewer project withdrawals, because when a project gets a quote for a $400 million upgrade, it's really unlikely to be built. So with that, I will pass it to my colleagues, but thanks everyone for your attention.
That was a wonderful presentation, Julia. Thank you so much. Very helpful lead into our remaining panelists talking about the regulatory landscape. A couple just quick notes. One, you've seen slide presentations here. The first 2 panels are going to involve slide decks, and then the final panel will not involve slides. and we're going to work to post the slides on our website following the event. Another quick note for those who are relatively new in this space, you've heard a lot of reference to organizations like PJM, MISO, SPP. Those are grid operators for their respective regions. They're basically the equivalent of ICE New England operating up here in our region. So I am going to now ask Katie to come on and take a deeper dive into the regulatory process, and with some focus on PJM and current activities there. Thanks, Katie.
Great. Yeah. Thank you, Jason. And can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Wonderful. All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Katie Signer again, and as Jason mentioned, I will be talking about the regulatory landscape for GETS at the RTO level, drawing on ongoing project experience that RMI has that includes a third-party analysis and stakeholder engagement around GETS in the PJM region, which spans much of the Mid-Atlantic all the way west to Illinois. And yeah, the motivation for this project was really a hope of catalyzing more GETS uptake in service of alleviating some of the interconnection bottleneck in PJM, which is really severe. And, PJM is taking steps to reform their interconnection study process, but in the meantime, not accepting new interconnection applications until 2026. So we're hoping that by demonstrating strong techno-economic potential through a study of GETS, similar to the type of report that Brattle Group did in SPP a few years ago, and then bringing our findings to PJM, but also to utilities and states and other stakeholders who might be interested in GETS and their associated benefits, such as bringing more clean energy online more quickly and their cost-saving potential, that we can spur action here and try to get some GETS deployed as a near-term solution to the interconnection issues that PJM as well as other RTOs are facing. So I'll get into how GETS are considered at the RTO level today, drawing mostly on my PJM experience, the case for regulatory change, and then opportunities for better integrating GETS into regional interconnection as well as transmission planning processes. So right now, PJM does not explicitly include any study, consideration, or encouragement of GETS in its planning and operations. They're, an ad hoc transmission tool that can be proposed and deployed at the decision or discretion of a transmission owning utility in PJM's footprint. And as Julia discussed, there are some incentive issues as well as just a general lack of familiarity with these new transmission technologies that may be preventing GETS from scaling their deployment beyond the pilot phase. But fortunately, that lack of familiarity is starting to change, and both utilities like PPL as well as PJM are starting to gain more experience with GETS through both real world deployments and then through study and analysis. So PJM's Applied Innovations Group, which is essentially their internal R&D team, has ongoing analysis and evaluation of GETS technologies underway, building up those modeling capabilities that Brent mentioned are so important for effective and reliable integration of GETS onto grid operators' systems. And PJM's partnered with utilities such as PPL with the handful of pilots that now exist in the region of both dynamic line ratings and more recently power flow controls, which are being deployed as a network upgrade alternative in ComEd territory for a wind project in PJM's interconnection queue. So the fact remains, however, despite these promising signs and pilots, that there's a lot of untapped potential for GETS in PJM, and for that matter, for the country at large, as Julia's map indicates. And, as I mentioned, PJM's interconnection queue has become incredibly backlogged with thousands of new, mostly clean energy projects that are looking to connect to the grid. And as you can see from the chart on the right in this slide, PJM, like most regions, there's actually more capacity in the interconnection queue than exists in PJM's entire system today in operations. So obviously not all of these projects will be built, but the pretty anemic pace at which new projects are coming online today due to the backlog and the associated delays in studying interconnecting projects, that's emerging as just a really primary barrier to state and federal clean energy and climate goals. And what's more, PJM is also experiencing increasing congestion on its transmission lines, as a recent grid strategies report illustrates. So you can see PJM singled out here, but also rising congestion costs are a pattern across all of the RTOs included in the chart on the left. So there's an increasingly urgent need to build out the capacity of the grid, but building new transmission and building for and paying for the network upgrades associated with interconnecting new projects takes a lot of time and money. So GETs have huge potential to help bridge this timing gap and avoid delays in integrating new clean energy onto the system by ensuring that we're using PJM or other RTOs existing systems to their fullest potential. And they can provide interconnecting customers with a quicker and cheaper network upgrade option while more or bigger lines are being built out to fully enable the energy transition to take place in the region. So I'll get into how we can realize that potential on the next slide. And for this current project, our focus is on regulatory changes that would bring GETs into more, to be more fully incorporated into the planning paradigm at RTOs. GETs can also be, there can be regulatory changes that address GETs consideration in an operational context, like the example that Julia shared in MISO, with allowing market participants to request topology optimization as a solution to cases of identified transmission congestion. But in terms of the two primary pathways to integrate GETs into planning contexts, which could better support their update in the short, medium, and longer term, we have integrating GETs into the interconnection study process. First off, so the facility study could include, as a default, the consideration of GETs as a possible network upgrade, not just at the request of the interconnection customer, which was the language that was proposed in the interconnection NOPR, and could potentially be strengthened in the final rule, we'll see. But really just considering GETs as a network upgrade as a matter of course would be, I think, a great improvement to making sure that we're keeping network upgrade costs to a reasonable level, and then thereby reducing the number of projects that drop out of the interconnection queue because they're hit with such high network upgrade costs that would kill the economics of their project. And the smart valve installations in ComEd territory to facilitate the interconnection of a wind project in central Illinois is a promising example of this type of an application of GETs. And then as far as, taking that idea for regulatory change and making it a reality in PJM, the stakeholder process here could involve bringing up this issue or this proposed reform in the interconnection process subcommittee that's ongoing at PJM, or perhaps developing language around this as part of the compliance filing for the FERC final interconnection rule, depending on what the language around GETs ends up being there. And now the second pathway for regulatory change is ensuring that GETs are routinely considered in transmission planning that PJM is doing. So PJM's, the RTEP is their regional transmission expansion plan process, and that could include consideration or cost benefit analyses that identify GETs as, as Bruce mentioned, as a complementary transmission solution to some of the build out of new lines that's needed. And promisingly here, PJM is launching a new long-term transmission planning process and just held a workshop on this last week. So that could be an opportunity to engage and secure GETs consideration as part of the new scenarios that they're building out there. And then we'll see what the final FERC order on transmission planning says, although the release of that final order is further out than the interconnection order, which is imminent. So I will wrap up here, and I'll also note that if there are specific questions on the analysis component of RMI's PJM GETs project or state-specific options for encouraging GETs uptake, I have a few reference slides that I think Jason will send out, and I can speak to those as well. But I'll pass it back to you, Jason, and look forward to the continued discussion.
Thanks so much, Katie, and really helpful to hear about how other regions are working to deploy GETs and hearing about some of the current regulatory processes that are in place. We also will be actively monitoring Thursday's FERC meeting and look forward to seeing what comes out in a final rule related to the interconnection queue reforms. Teron Hill is up next. Good to see you, Teron. And Teron is going to help us marry the regulatory and the practical and talk about some of the experiences that National Grid has had in terms of integrating GETs across multiple regions. Turn it over to you.
Awesome, thank you. Let me just get my slides up. There we go. Hopefully everyone can see the slides. Let me know if you can't. So National Grid has experience deploying GETs in multiple jurisdictions due to our service area being both in New England, New York, as well as in the UK. One of the things that I really want to touch upon is that when you think about GETs, and many of the panelists today have really touched upon this, it's not just the technology and the opportunities as well as the capabilities of the technology itself, but it's also how you look at transmission planning and how you look at the policies that are part of that transmission planning landscape that help to enable transmission for a clean energy future, as well as being able to utilize GETs, is really a complement to really help bridge the capability on the existing system that exists today, as well as being something that can help us to move forward with renewables and clean energy implementation on a quick basis while we're still planning out the transmission system and constructing this transmission assets. Many of the panelists have noted earlier that it takes time to build transmission. It takes time to permit it. It takes time to make sure that you have the right solutions. It takes time to make sure you have the stakeholders on board. And so GETs in many cases can help us to really bridge that gap and to move forward on a very quick basis. When you think about New England has aggressive transmission, aggressive clean energy goals in place to really decarbonize. And those goals are absolutely essential. They're the right goals. They're the goals that's needed to create a clean energy economy and create jobs for New England. But it's also needed in order to help bring down the cost of energy over the long term. At the same time that we need to put on a significant amount of clean energy resources onto the network, we're also seeing in the future that load is going to grow up, and transportation specifically is going to create significant load demand on our networks. When you think about just medium and heavy duty vehicles alone, our own independent studies show that medium and heavy duty vehicles are a small portion of the vehicles in the Commonwealth. However, they have an outsized impact when it comes to pollution and particulate emissions. And so the need to really start to decarbonize transportation that's essential when it comes to moving us towards a clean energy economy and decarbonizing. When you think about putting more clean energy resources onto the network while at the same time accounting for future load growth, in all cases, transmission is essential to that clean energy future. And one of the things that when you think about transmission is that we should be thinking about how we utilize, and the Secretary spoke about this earlier, utilizing existing transmission corridors and rights of way. Our customers and communities are telling us that they want to minimize the impact of new infrastructure on their communities. And one way to do that is by utilizing, upgrading existing rights of way. We must also start thinking about how do we deploy transmission ahead of the generation resources, noting that it can take many years to build transmission, but far less years in order to put new generation resources into the network. And so this is why we look at GETs. We look at GETs because they can be deployed quickly. Very often they don't require line outages. And one of the things when we think about GETs is that we have to start thinking about them not just in terms of planning, but in congestion reduction, but also how can we use GETs in order to do things like outage management, for instance, and be able to reduce localized impacts that are fairly temporary, such that we can get towards that more clean energy vision and landscape that we all hope for. National Grid, when we start thinking about gas, we were starting to think about what are those technologies that we need to really look at that will have an ability to allow us to optimize the existing system and be a lower cost for customers. Really starting to realize that not all solutions that's going to help us get to that clean energy future means still in the ground. We start small, working with industry partners, and we did a small demonstration project here in the Commonwealth on 2 of our 115 circuits. Really just trying to get more experience with the technology and understand how it could impact our system. You can see some of the real-time dashboards that from a point in time from those deployments, in which we did 2 DLR deployments. One that was a contact sensor that was deployed directly on the conductor. Another one that was a non-contact sensor that was deployed on the transmission line itself, and that's what that picture is of. That uses.
Hey, Turan, I'm not seeing the slides advance on my computer. I don't know if others are, but.
Is there a delay, or are you still on slide 2?
I'm still on the first slide.
Oh, really? That's funny. It's the point. It's moving around my side. Let me stop sharing for a second.
We'll give it a try. And if you can't do it, I can pull up the deck as well.
Will you mind pulling up the deck to see if it works on your side?
Sure, just give me a second. Can you see the deck?
I can see it on my side. Thank you. Sorry about that.
No problem.
So that's so no one saw slide 2 when I was going through?
I don't think so. You should be on slide 2 now, and let me know when you want me to advance it.
So just when I was going through the needs for transportation, I just want to highlight here, since no one saw the slide earlier, when you think about medium heavy duty vehicles, National Grid, working with CalStar and RMI, we've done some studies that show that there's going to be a huge need to electrify the transportation sector, and that it's actually a significant amount of load. So I just want to point people to that study. I'm not going to repeat the rest of the slide, but that study is something that folks should look at, because I don't think people realize the impact, especially of medium heavy duty vehicles, will have on our electric grid. Jason, if you can go to slide 3. And this is a slide where I was talking about National Grid's deployment of DLR here in the Commonwealth, in which we deployed 2 different types of sensors, looking at both a non-contact sensor, which is that picture right there that you see, as well as a contact sensor, which is similar to the type of sensor that David in his presentation earlier was talking about, in which just jump into the results of the study, one of the things that we saw is that when you look at dynamic ratings versus static ratings, we saw roughly a 30% increase in the ratings. However, some of the things to note, and Brent spoke about this earlier, is that when you think about DLR, it's not just that line itself, but it's also downstream impacts of that increase in flow over that circuit. And so when we think about dynamic line rating, we wanted to get a sense of, is this a viable technology? And our studies show that it absolutely is a viable technology that has a lot of promise, but it's very important that we look at from a full regional network type of approach. And when you go to slide 4, when it comes to looking at specific cases, all these technologies are really about what is the problem that you're trying to solve, as well as what's the location, because it's very important that you put these in the right location to have the type of effect and outcome that you want to have. And one of the things that we found in New York is that in New York, we have a significant amount of onshore wind located out in Western New York. And many times of the day, there isn't a lot of load in Western New York. Most of the load is towards Eastern New York and downstate New York, that there could be a significant amount of curtailments of that onshore wind. But one of the things where DLR is great, especially for wind resources, is that if the wind's blowing and the wind is generating, it has a cooling effect on the transmission line. And so these are places where you can see DLR having a great benefit to the network, because there is that cooling effect, which means that there should be more capability in the circuit to allow the wind to not be curtailed and to have benefits to the system. One of the things I love to point out is the New York Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. And this is a type of policy landscape that I believe is really instrumental in helping to move forward the type of outcomes that we want to see when it comes to decarbonizing the system and bringing more transmission onto the networks. In the New York CLCPA, the regulators challenged the utilities to say, hey, here's the outcome that we're looking for. We want to see 70% renewables by 2030, net zero by 2040. And the way to move that forward is the existing transmission network, in which we've already built up a significant amount of transmission. And the way to move forward is to upgrade those existing assets by taking things like asset condition projects and looking at the upgrades that can really help to give you multiple benefits, not just rebuilding like for like, but also bringing more capability in order to get more renewables and to mitigate the curtailments of the existing resources while planning for future resources. So in New York, the utilities have put together plans to build out the transmission network ahead of renewables coming online, such that the transmission is there for renewables to move forward, while at the same time reducing the amount of curtailments that we currently see. And in this case, DLR was used in order to increase additional headroom of 150 megawatts for that Western New York wind, while at the same time, we're still moving forward reconductoring projects to address asset condition issues on those lines. The key thing here is that, unlike the demo that we did in Massachusetts, the New York deployment is directly being plugged into our EMS, our energy management system, which is critical if you're going to really realize those benefits. In slide 5, if I move towards the UK, in the UK, you have a significant amount of wind resources that's located in the north of the UK, in the Scotland area, while most of the load is located in the south of the UK, in England and Wales. And the regulatory regime over in the UK is very different than it is here in the Northeast US. So it's very different than it is in the US in general, in which transmission owners are really incentivized for the outcomes, the outputs, they call them, that regulators and policymakers want to see. And so under the framework that they call it RIO, revenues equals incentives plus innovation plus outputs, the transmission owners have an incentive to really look at new technologies and new innovations in order to make sure that they're getting the right outcomes for customers. one of the cases we use a power flow converters in order to really increase the flows, in which prior we had overloads because of the amount of wind that was located in Scotland. And we were able to use power flow converters in order to deploy those in strategic places throughout the grid. And we found that that congestion on the network was reduced, in which we're calculating about $470 million in savings. It is a shared savings approach over there with Rio. And so those shared savings go back to customer, but also it amounts to higher revenues for transmission owners. And at the end of the day, it pays for itself. We're looking at, in the UK, ability to deploy power flow converters across the system, in which we believe that there's up to 10 gigawatts of capacity that can be unlocked by doing that. If you move to slide 6, some things to note, though, is that, and Brent talked about this earlier, is that there are some challenges. GETS is something that we absolutely should be looking at. It's something that can help us with interconnections. It can help us with the system. But they come with challenges that are no small challenge, and they have to be mitigated in order to really see a huge amount of deployment, a significant amount of deployment of these technologies. And one of the biggest issues is really the familiarizing with power electronic technologies on our system, and what that means to how we model these technologies, and what it means to the protection systems, such that we're not actually creating more challenges as we move forward. A lot of these other issues have been talked about, but two of the things I really want to hit upon is New England operates in a very small geographical area, and our system is affected by what happens actually in other neighboring control areas. And so sometimes you may find that some of these technologies actually, like when you think about voltage constraints in New York and how they affect New England, need to deploy outside of the region actually to have a bigger impact. And so there is a need for us to not just look at what's needed for New England, but to also look at our adjacent systems and what's needed for the Northeast, in order for us to really start to utilize those systems in a way that can help us to decarbonize quicker. If there's one thing that I can leave you with, is that at the end of the day, GETS is complement to transmission. We still need to upgrade our existing system. We should upgrade our existing system within the existing corridor such that we can minimize community impacts. But as we're upgrading the system, because it takes a long time to build transmission, we should be looking at GETS in order to help bridge that gap, such that we can get more renewables in the system quicker. Is when you think about the previous presentations by Julia and Katie, there is a real need to get the interconnection process right. There's a real need to get renewables in the system. It took us 30 years to go from a system that was mostly oil and coal to natural gas. It cannot take us 30 years to go from a system that's mostly natural gas to renewables. Thank you, Jason.
Thank you, Teron. There's really above and beyond. Not only did you talk about how GETS interact between systems, but also you gave us a little bit of a flavor for GETS deployment across the pond. That was really helpful. We're gonna move right into the panel discussion. This is sort of our roll up the sleeves. Whiteboarding may be part of a program, and gonna ask everyone to come on, and also note that I'm gonna enable the Q&A feature in a moment. So if people want to start putting questions in, we can get to those as well. I think I'm gonna sort of exercise the moderator's prerogative and ask the first question to kick things off. From listening to your presentations earlier, it does seem like in an area with a lot of congestion that deploying GETS is really a no sort of least regrets or no regrets type of a strategy. We heard earlier that there's very little congestion in the ISO New England region. So my question is whether or not there's a case to be made for deploying GETS in our region here in New England at this time. I'll open it up to whoever wants to start. Bruce raised his hand first.
Sure. One of the studies that New England, ISO New England is doing right now, if I understand it correctly, is trying to look at topology optimization in a ways to reduce congestion or production cost increase during outages. What topology control does is it opens and closes lines and directs the flow away from the congested areas. So it's like closing the entrance on a highway when there's congestion on that highway. So the cars will not enter the highway there and make the congestion worse. So by doing that, it's actually helping reducing the congestion during outages or potentially rescheduling the outages so that the outage impact is minimal. So that is something that all the systems can do. And I commend New England for doing that, also for New England for having a policy internally saying, when you plan on an outage, you better make sure that the congestion impact is minimal. That is something more to look forward to, but those things are what topology optimization can do. And it also shows that it can be, these technologies can be used for planning and not only operations as well.
Dave, did you have a reaction or another follow-up?
No, just a follow-up to what Bruce said. Our first two cases for dynamic line ratings, at least, were related to congestion as the primary factor. We have kicked off pilots after that. Like we've installed DLR, and we've established 5 other lines that are more interconnection focused. It is a mix of interconnecting generators as well as interconnecting, I'll say, load, because we're also looking at it from the standpoint of like economic development. Sometimes there's businesses and things like that that want to come in and connect, but then when they see the cost to connect, it could be a hurdle to them connecting to the system. What we're starting to find initially is that when you just match up a dynamic line rating, say sensor pilot, with a single generator, especially if it's a renewable generator, it's hard to match because you have like dynamic generation with dynamic basically line ratings. But where you can put it in a location where it's a little bit more diverse and aggregated with different renewable generators or a mix of interconnecting generation and load, we are finding that it kind of increases that threshold to allow cheap interconnection. And so, that's kind of where we're focused next. There's definitely more challenges with the interconnection side of it, but we're optimistic that we can find some really good use cases for it.
Julie, I see you nodding your head, Julie, and this might relate to some of your discussion about interconnection queue issues.
Yeah, there was a good study by the Idaho National Laboratory that looked at an offshore wind interconnection point in Southeast Massachusetts and looked at potential curtailment of wind interconnecting there in the future, and looked at grid enhancing technologies as a potential solution to that congestion. So I think as ISO New England looks to the future, hopefully GETs are being used to increase capacity at those relatively few good points for clean energy interconnection, especially offshore.
Brent.
Yeah, Julia just stole my thunder. I think right now there's a few applications where I think there may be some cost benefit value for New England customers on the system. But I think when we look forward, that's where we'll see the potential for the use of these technologies.
Does anyone else want to take a stab, or do you want to move to the next question?
Maybe I'll just add from a grid strategies perspective, which is my employer, and Katie referenced our study that showed limited congestion in ISO New England. But Tehran mentioned that interconnection between regions around ISO New England is limited, and that could be an area where increasing transmission capacity has a big impact, and congestion between ISOs is not super well documented. So there could be a big opportunity there.
Assistant Secretary Nuara, turn it to you for a question, and I'm going to take a look at the Q&A while you're doing that.
Sure, and I'm looking at some of the Q&A now, and we've got an audience with a variety of backgrounds, and some are very new to the subject matter. Some of you mentioned reconductoring and how grid enhancing technologies can avoid the need to some extent for reconductoring. Can someone just break down what it means to reconductor a line? And Tehran, I see you coming off mute. You mentioned this specifically, and then also just building on that question, what can grid enhancing technologies do in addition to avoiding the need for reconductoring? Are there kind of a menu benefits that we will see.
Sure, I can help out with what is reconductoring, because I think I said the word reconductoring earlier in my presentation. So if you think about transmission line, usually we just call them lines, but the actual thing carrying the power, that line is conductor. And when we say reconductoring, we mean putting up new conductor on that line. And in doing so, many of our transmission lines, especially here in the Northeast, were built 30, 40 years ago. Some lines are even older than that. And so the technology's improved quite a bit. And so very often you can have a line of the same voltage, but put a newer conductor on that line and increase the capacity by doing so. Sometimes we do also reconductor at a higher voltage too in order to carry even more power through that corridor. It's important because at the end of the day, we do have a fairly significant transmission network across the Northeast, and it's going to be important that we utilize the existing corridors that already exist in order to carry more power through those corridors, such that we're not disturbing communities and utilizing the assets that are already there. Reconductoring is going to be a huge amount of the type of upgrades that we see going forward. And in the case of New York, where I was talking about that DLR deployment, we were using DLR in order to get capacity through while we're going through that reconductoring project. So I was able to really use a technology in order to get benefits today, because it takes time to build transmission. And so it allowed us to, for the existing wind farms that were being curtailed, it allowed us to increase the capacity of those wind farms, but at the same time, get an even bigger upgrade going such that we can help out future generation that wants to connect to our system.
Very helpful.
And give it to the other panelists if you want to add anything about reconductoring.
Great, thank you, Taran. Another question from Q&A, Jason?
I have a question as the Q&A is starting to come in. This references back some comments during the earlier presentation, but just wondering what the utility case is for deploying GETs. I mean, traditionally utilities have they've put assets into operation. They earn a return on a return of investment. What's the case for utilities to use GETs, and is there a need to provide different kinds of incentives or regulatory structures around that, like performance-based? I don't know if yeah, Dave, I thought maybe you or Taran might be well positioned to address that initially, and then others please jump in.
I was just saying, I mean, most transmission issues or upcoming violations on the system have numerous solutions that could work. And our perspective is dynamic line ratings is now another tool in our toolbox. It also happens to be one that's very inexpensive compared to other solutions. So for us, if dynamic line ratings can be used on a line, that's the right thing to do by the customer is to use it. And so for us, we've been asked by FERC and things like that after we got our pilot up and running and it started to plug into market operations. We were asked like, why did you do it? And, there isn't as much incentive for this, but our response was basically like, we're a regulated company that is entrusted with customers. And when there's a technology or innovation that is what's best for the customer, then we have an obligation to use it. And so, wherever there's congestion or asset health issues and things like that on the line, just because of the cost of it, if dynamic line rating solves it, then that's always plan A for us.
Jason, if I could just add, completely agree with everything that David's just said. At the end of the day, as a utility, we're entrusted with ensuring that we not only maintain the reliability and safety of the networks, but that we're also helping to facilitate the policy that our states have put forward and the federal government has put forward. And so when you think about that need that the Commonwealth has told us that we are going to be one of the states in the country that are aggressively moving forward with decarbonization. New York has said the same thing, and in the jurisdiction that we operate, as well as the UK, where National Grid operates. And so as a company, we are completely committed to making sure that our transmission networks are not hindrance to facilitating that policy, but help to enable that policy, which means that we have to look at every solution and not discount any solution that could be available and possible. And so for us, it was really about, when you think about how much transmission needs to be upgraded, it is significant. How can we do it in a way that helps to move things faster and help to lower the cost for our customers?
I might just weigh in on the incentive issue, which is we really see the need for a top-down and bottom-up pressure on GETS. So if you have motivated, forward-thinking engineers and folks like David and Tehran who are pushing these solutions, that's great. But the incentive issue is, would help with a top-down approach. If you have folks who are charged with the fiscal health of the utility and aren't thinking as much on the engineering level, we want them to be asking about these tools too and making it a priority in the organization.
If I may add, I think there's the financial well-doing of the utility, but you have to remember that the financial well-doing of the utility is contingent on the ratepayers being able to pay the rates. And what we observed is that in various renewable intervention studies that are trying to figure out how much it's going to cost to achieve 100% clean energy, the costs are significant. They're in the billions of dollars, sometimes approaching $100 billion for, let's say, a utility, a mid to large size utility. And the fact that you're going to have to have something like $50 to $100 billion of debt alone is going to reduce your credit ratings by a few notches. And that credit rating notch drop alone is going to increase your rates by 20–30%. So that's before any investment is done. And so the GETS actually has, applying GETS where appropriate actually does have a secondary effect of making sure that the utility is financially healthy while the ratepayers are not overly burdened by investments that could otherwise be avoided. So that is another part of GETS that's not necessarily always discussed about, because we tend to focus more on the technicality and what it can do, but that is one more side of the GETS that we should be aware of.
Yeah, and I'll just add to this that I like to think of GETS sometimes as akin to energy efficiency. GETS are like energy efficiency solutions for the grid, and in a similar way, they can sometimes be overlooked or disincentivized because they're so cheap, or their solutions not as that might not be top of mind in certain contexts. But for the role of a utility regulator, like a state PUC or state policymaker, RMI just released a blog last week that talks about 4 ways that states like Massachusetts can help spur GETS uptake by kind of incrementally doing things like initiating an investigative proceeding and making sure that utilities in their jurisdiction are familiar with and experienced with GETS, and gain the relevant capacity building or skills to be ready to integrate them. State regulators can also require GETS consideration through something like a cost benefit analysis, and then require deployments in cases where the cost benefit analysis is positive. They could also develop an incentive or do some other kind of performance-based rulemaking to remove a disincentive that might be present for GETS. And then finally, states can also engage in RTO or FERC proceedings to make sure that that GETS are being deployed as widely and scaled as quickly as possible to ensure that their states with RPS policies or other climate goals, that their goals are not being stymied by lack of available transmission.
See, another question that came in has to do with vehicle electrification, and it's basically as we sort of move as a region toward electrifying the transportation sector, that's going to add more demand to the system. Is there a role that GETS can play in terms of helping to manage that demand And this may even go to Bruce, to your point on affordability as well, separate from the operations. Dave?
So I'll just say, for us, for our electric vehicle studies and forecasts, I think that, the power grid was built to handle load. So in our experience, electric vehicles have less of an impact on the grid than, say, like DER does, with like two-way flow of power and things like that. And the electric vehicle use does tie up hosting capacities at the distribution system level, which then does make it that, say, a solar generator, once it's tied into alignment, has a lot of EV on it. Maybe it makes it more of a challenge for them to interconnect. But in some cases, it could actually be a help, because now you don't have to worry about two-way flow of power, but it's locally ingested. So from what we've seen, we have not seen that many issues with say, increased electric vehicle usage on our grid. And even our forecasts, like worst case forecasts, really aren't that bad. But it is an example of why it's important to study the application of GETs at lower voltage levels, because there is a lot happening at those lower voltage levels where there could be good use cases that we haven't taken advantage of yet.
Just one quick follow-up on that, Dave, on your point. By lower voltage levels, you mean it could be the distribution system. We've been talking about implementing GETs on the ISO New England higher voltage system, but that's another potential pathway. Is there any work being done at the distribution level in New England that you're aware of with respect to these technologies?
So not yet in New England. We do have one pilot in distribution in a different territory, where we do plan to in Rhode Island, to run a pilot at the distribution level, because what we found is that when you get that percentage of increase at the distribution, and you can go to the next interconnecting generator or load customer and say, actually, you don't really have any upgrade costs. I mean, that really is huge for that customer. And so that's kind of like one of like our mindsets and goals. Just one of the things, contrast cost-wise though, is transmission projects tend to be expensive. So if you can defer or supplant a transmission project with DLR, it's like a no-brainer cost comparison. But at distribution level, the projects aren't as expensive, and so the cost difference isn't as much. So it's sometimes harder to get over the cost threshold, where it might be cheaper to reconduct a distribution line. Not necessarily cheaper, but it's not as big of a difference than, say, the DLR solution. Does that make sense?
Weezy, I'm going to turn it to you for the next question.
Sure. So building off of the very first question you asked, Jason, just given the real meaningful limits here in New England being voltage and stability, curious, Brent, your thoughts on whether there's a category of grid enhancing technologies that has maybe the most promise here in New England, just given some of your comments from earlier.
So probably the thing that I think shows the most promise over time. So let me back up for a second. So you can kind of see we're getting more and more detailed with the way we rate equipment. ISO New England already has the ability to manually adjust ratings based on ambient temperatures. With Order 881, that'll become automated. So then if you go to dynamic line ratings, that allows us to bring in the impact of wind. So it's really whether or not that each of these incremental costs is worthwhile. But I can easily see that in the future, with the way essentially a lot of the wind farms are interconnecting, they have a limited resource, where it is. And so I see the potential for dynamic line ratings being used. But as David alluded to, we want to be careful that we're not, right at the exit path of a single generator and trying to chase ratings up, down, up, down, up, down. The rest of the systems has to balance against that. But I do think that from a congestion reduction point of view, that's really where there's going to be a fair amount of potential in the future. We have looked at different types of power flow control in New England. Contrary to what some people have seen here, the cost estimates we got are actually about twice as much as conventional technology. So we, again, looking at cost effectiveness of the devices, we didn't move forward with that. So I think there are applications and it is something we watch out for, but I think market efficiency is really going to be where the potential exists.
That's helpful, Brent. Any reaction from our panelists?
Not exactly to the question, but I want to highlight that, and I hope that Brent shares this view, that the ISOs and utilities are dealing with a transition to dynamic modeling and other and probabilistic methods in other contexts. So with renewable energy forecasting and capacity accreditation and these other topics have seen a transition from, supposed certainty and consistency to something that's more dependent on ambient conditions. So I think this is a change. It's I'm sure a culture shift going on and changes going on throughout these organizations that are very interesting and exciting.
I have another question that came in on the Q&A, and just I think the broader context is we've talked a lot about how GETS can address issues of congestion, market efficiency. We haven't talked as much about reliability specifically, and this question asks how GETS might help address some of New England's winter reliability challenges. Brent, I guess I'll start with you, but also I'm going to say that you're a transmission planner. You have colleagues that are involved in operations and winter issues, maybe more specifically. So understand if you want to defer in the first instance.
Yeah, so I talked about this earlier when I was talking about the ambient adjusted line ratings. One of the things this will allow us to do for winter peak load conditions, let me back up. So today we have a static line rating. I'm not going to try and hide from that unless we actually are given updated ratings into our control room by the utility owners. So it's a 50-degree Fahrenheit rating in the winter, and that it's tough to have a very high winter load when it's 50 degrees Fahrenheit out, right? So in the future, when we're studying the conditions that drive these absolutely incredible loads that we're talking about, in our 2050 transmission study, we're looking at doubling the system load from what we've ever experienced in the past. We'll be able to better align our transmission facility ratings with conditions that more closely match what it would take to get a peak load. But that's still coming from the ambient adjusted. We'll have to think through whether or not the wind impact is really meaningful enough to take that on. So I think the ambient adjusted, like I talked about with Wheezy's question, gets us a big step. And I'm just not sure. We'll have to evaluate whether or not there's benefit for the next step after that, of being able to account for the impact of wind on that.
Bruce?
Following up on Brent's ambient adjusted, I think there was a winter storm a few years ago where New England and New York were hammered by a winter storm. And what New England did was, as Brent said, New England is based on static ratings, but they allowed ambient temperature ratings at the time, and that allowed a lot more flow between the two systems, which eventually avoided blackouts or brownouts or other reliability mishaps that could have happened. So it's going forward. And going back to Julia's comment on how the industry is evolving, look back in 10 years ago, in 2010, when a lot of systems were looking at renewable integration studies. In those days, people said, hey, if you have more than 10% or 20% of renewables, it's going to collapse the system. SPP nowadays occasionally hits 90% renewables, their annual generation from wind is about 30%. And that's only 10 years ago. So I think in the next decade, as people get used to these technologies, they're going to get used to the flexibility of the transmission, just like they got used to the flexibility of generation. So I'm hopeful that these technologies will help us get there in the long term. But again, these technologies actually provide more value during extreme times like winter storms or whatnots.
Yeah, and just building on that, some of my colleagues did an analysis and released a blog earlier this year about the potential for increased renewables, specifically wind, and more transmission, which I think could be you could include GETS in that more transmission bucket. The potential of those two together to have avoided some of the blackouts we just saw last winter with Winter Storm Elliott. So I can provide a link to that blog in the chat, Jason, for you to share more widely. But yeah, I think, GETS, similar to how transmission and a diverse resource mix can be assets for reliability, GETS can certainly play a role in that as well.
So just one real quick question, and then I think we're going to move to your key takeaways. And this question doesn't relate specifically to GETS, but I think it's in the context of us envisioning these pop-up forums as really public educational opportunities. The question is why New England has so much less congestion relative to other regions. I think the panel is thinking it through, but I mean, I will note that there's been about $12 billion of transmission built since 2002, and I think that has something to do with it. Dave, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I'll just say I can't speak for like ISO New England or so I don't want to speak out of turn. But typically, when you look at congestion in any of the RTOs, it's driven by either a lack of transmission or a shift in the generation mix. So where you see like generation retirements and new generation coming online and things like that, then that will typically adjust flows on the system, and then congestion will start to come through. So I think in New England, it's kind of like a somewhat of a mix of both. There's been a good healthy transmission build out, then also coupled with there's a lot of generation in queue, like take offshore wind, 18 gigawatts in the ISO New England queue. Once that comes online, we'll probably start to see congestion in the future because it'll change the flows. So it's probably like a transmission build out coupled with a lack of incoming new generation at this moment that has caused a lack of congestion. Maybe Brett, you can like fact check me on that. But yeah.
Right.
Did you want to respond? Yeah, I was trying to before, and my internet connection died right in the middle of you asking a question. So sorry about that. So again, a little history here. If we go way back, when new resources were added to the New England transmission system, they were built so that they could run under most conditions. So they were built, and the interconnections to those resources were built such that there was very little congestion unto itself. Where we saw congestion coming in the mid to late 2000s was actually the opposite. The system had been built around these resources, and you needed these older, more expensive resources in order to reliably serve the load. So we spent, 12, I think we're approaching $13 billion soon, making sure that we could run the system without reliance on these resources. It was incredibly expensive. If the resource wasn't available, it was unreliable. We received a lot of state feedback from state legislatures to never let this happen again. So we built the system to do that. I think what's going to be different in the future is the interconnection resources are interconnecting under a different standard. It's more of a competitive standard where they come on and they can their neighbor can be assumed to shut off next to them. And that's really what's going to walk us into congestion, because these are all very low cost resources. Once they're built, their fuel cost is effectively zero. And that's why I think we're going to be coming up on congestion once these resources start to materialize. But that's why we didn't have it in the past until we started getting into these resources trying to shut down, or if you actually looked at what happened if they were not available for a day.
Thanks, Brent. One last quick one before we do some final thoughts, final takeaways from the panelists. We've got a lot of great questions coming in and trying to get to all of them, but just quickly, is there any interplay between demand response resources and grid enhancing technologies? It gets to the question maybe earlier about their application on the distribution system, but any thoughts there about the use of grid enhancing technologies when it comes to a resource like demand response? Go ahead, Brent.
Yeah, I think they're complementary. I don't see any reason you couldn't use one or both in certain circumstances. I don't think one would displace the other.
Got it. Go ahead, David.
Yeah, and increasingly the grid is going to be more and more of different dynamic elements of the power grid coming together to still make it that there's 120 volts and 60 hertz at our outlets at our homes, and dynamic line ratings and demand response and other forms of throttling generation are just going to be key elements of that new dynamic grid. That's how we'll get the most use from the grid that's built.
Yeah, and I'll also add that, as the system becomes more dynamic and involves a broader set and more diverse set of resources to maintain reliability and meet load, a lot of these tools, similarly offer more visibility, more data, and enhancements to the system, in addition to some of the challenges that they might create with respect to learning curves and making sure that we can integrate these new resources effectively while also not missing a step and running the grid that we have. I think, like David was alluding to earlier, some of the increased visibility and information that you can get from deploying these new technologies can be a real asset to utilities and grid operators.
So we're coming to the end here. Just wanted to give the panelists an opportunity to provide maybe a minute or two just on what your key takeaways would be from this forum. I'm just gonna look at the order of my boxes and start. Kate, I'm gonna start back with you and work my way down.
Sure. I'd say my takeaway is that to me, GETs are the no regrets tools that we should be installing wherever they make sense while we're figuring out how to solve for and build the harder stuff, like the new transmission lines, the new generation, and everything else that we need to do to make sure that the energy transition goes full steam ahead for mitigating climate change.
Get to the highest low-hanging fruit. Thanks. Brent.
Yeah, I think it's I think there are tools in the toolbox. I don't think we should force fit anything. We should look at the cost benefit. Certain applications of GETs are extremely cheap, and they should be looked at for their value. But as I said too in my presentation, we have a lot of software and hardware issues to overcome. We're making progress on that through Order 881, things like that. But these really have to be overcome before we can, go hog wild on this stuff.
Julia.
Yeah, I think I recommend everyone check out the Joint Federal State Task Force on Electric Transmissions recording of their meeting on July 16th. There was led off with a great presentation from EPRI about these technologies, and then also lots of commentary from state regulators on the problems they're trying to solve, the extent of their authority to solve them versus what the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission can do. So anyways, I'll start with that. But one thing that came out of that meeting, and I think also this meeting, is that to deploy GETs effectively and get the full value out of them, the utilities will have to, departments of the utilities will have to talk to each other in a way that they maybe haven't before. And then different groups across the regulatory world will also have to work together. So I think there's a de-siloing transformation that will go on in addition to these technological transitions and all the other things going on. So I know there's a long list of priorities for transmission owners and system operators and utilities. And I hope that the role of GETS in addressing the clean energy integration, the customer savings, a swath of those priorities can be addressed with a swath of technologies. And I hope that comes through.
Thanks. Bruce.
Yeah, I think I said this earlier, but the folks in the industry have learned how to deal with variability of renewables through generation, and now it's kind of shifting from generation and transmission. And one key message that I like to make, and I think we all understand it, is that GETs are not here to replace transmission. It's more to augment transmission. It's complementary. It can just get a few things done at a much lower cost and at a much faster speed, but it's never going to replace transmission. It's never going to replace, it's like GPS will help you drive easier, but it's never going to replace the need for a car. It's never going to replace the need for more roads. So with that in mind, I think it should be part of the overall bigger picture of planning rather than to say, here's our transmission planning. Let's see if GETS can fit it in. I'd rather have everything, including the demand response and other technologies that are out there, to be part of the planning so that people can compare them easily among themselves and then try to put them in a separate bucket.
Thanks, Bruce. Dave.
I think I'll just close with there are a lot of challenges to the full implementation of GETS, but they tend not to be as complex or difficult as what sometimes they're presented as. That a lot of the challenges go away as soon as you start to look at them, and overall it's really not as complicated as often put forward. So I think to me it's like an action first orientation is what's best, because once I think different companies and others start to dig into it, they'll find that a lot of the challenges go away.
We'll finish it out with you, Teron.
Thank you. I think what I would just add is just that when you think about the future grid, it's going to be a lot more dynamic. It's going to have a lot more variable energy resources on it. We're going to depend on a lot more types of solutions to move us forward. At the end of the day, all of it requires transmission, and we shouldn't be looking at GETS as being an alternative to transmission. Bruce said earlier, GETS is transmission. It's more innovation, more technology to improve the real-time capability of the system. We need to really start thinking about GETS in that fashion. What is the transmission upgrade that's going to get us to the least cost, most efficient solution for customers?
It's a great way to leave it off, and just an enormous thank you from Mass EEA to this panel. Couldn't ask for a better group of panelists to kick off what hopefully will be a series of pop-up forums, and really for folks like me that don't have a technical background, you really helped me understand this technology better, and it really is critical to us optimizing the system and transitioning to our future clean energy grid. Just a quick note that we are going to work on getting the slides up at some point following this presentation, as well as work on getting this session up in recorded form. So with that, again, I'll thank you, and Wheezy, I'm going to turn it back to you for a final word.
Thanks, Jason. Echoing your word of thanks, really appreciate your time this afternoon and providing such great information to folks who joined. We had a great turnout, and it's because of the Rockstar panel that we had today. So thank you all again for your time, and any follow-up questions, please be sure to send them our way, and we'll hopefully get them answered. Thanks, everybody. Take care. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you, you too.
Thank you.